Mariupol, a once thriving city on the Sea of Azov, was home to nearly 500,000 people, and it was well known for its steel production and maritime trade. It had already survived previous attacks during the conflict in 2014, when Russian-backed separatists had first taken aim at Ukraine's sovereignty. But in 2022, Mariupol was confronted with a threat far greater than before. This is the story of Mariupol and how this city and its people were caught in the deadliest siege Europe has seen since World War II. In late February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Mariupol, located in the southeast of Ukraine, quickly found itself in the crosshairs of Russian forces. The city's strategic importance was undeniable. It was not only a vital port on the Sea of Azov, providing access to global markets, but also a crucial link between Crimea, annexed by Russia in 2014, and the Russian-backed separatist territories in Donetsk and Luhansk. From the very beginning, Mariupol's location made it a key objective for Russian forces. Within days, Russian troops and separatist forces had begun their advance, with the aim of surrounding and isolating the city. On March 1, 2022, Mariupol was encircled. The blockade had begun. As the noose tightened around Mariupol, its residents quickly realized they were trapped. The roads leading in and out of the city were blocked. No food, water, or medical supplies could get in, and no civilians could escape. The city's power grid was knocked offline, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness. It was the beginning of what would become one of the longest and most brutal sieges of the war. Almost immediately after the encirclement, Russian forces unleashed a relentless barrage of artillery and airstrikes on Mariupol. What began as targeted strikes soon devolved into indiscriminate bombardment. Civilian infrastructure was deliberately targeted. Homes, schools, and even hospitals were not spared from the devastation. In the first few days, residents sought refuge in basements and makeshift shelters, but as the shelling intensified, it became clear that nowhere in Mariupol was safe. One of the most shocking moments in the early days of the siege occurred on March 9th, when a Russian airstrike hit Mariupol's maternity hospital. The hospital, which had been filled with expectant mothers, newborns, and healthcare workers, was reduced to rubble in an instant. The attack killed at least 3 people and left many more wounded. The world watched in horror as images of pregnant women being carried out of the wreckage were broadcast globally. The hospital bombing became a symbol of the indiscriminate violence that had come to define the siege.
We're going to show you here. These are the first images coming in of what Ukraine says was a Russian bombing of a maternity hospital and children's ward in the southern port city of Mariupol. Ukrainian President Zelensky says that there are children under the rubble. There are no known military targets anywhere near this hospital.
Save lives, close the skies. 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 Save lives, close the skies.
As the shelling continued, civilians sought refuge wherever they could. Many gathered in the basement of the Mariupol Drama Theatre, hoping it would offer them some protection from the relentless bombardments. The theatre had become a haven for over 1,000 civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly. Outside the building, in giant letters clearly visible from the sky, the word "children" had been painted on the ground in a desperate attempt to ward off attacks. But the warnings were ignored. On March 16th, Russian forces bombed the theatre, reducing it to rubble. While some civilians managed to survive in the shelter beneath, it's estimated that up to 600 people were killed in the strike, marking it one of the deadliest single attacks on civilians during the war. The bombing of the theatre shocked the world. International condemnation was swift, but for the people of Mariupol, it was just another day in a siege that had no end in sight. By late April, Mariupol had been almost entirely occupied by Russian forces, save for one final stronghold, the Azovstal steel plant. This massive industrial complex, a sprawling maze of buildings, tunnels and bunkers, became the head of the Ukrainian resistance. For weeks, a small contingent of Ukrainian soldiers, including members of the Azov regiment and Marines, fought valiantly to hold the plant. Despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, they refused to surrender. Their resistance became the symbol of Ukrainian defiance, embodying the nation's will to fight against overwhelming odds. Within the steel plant's underground network, hundreds of civilians, including women and children, had also sought refuge. For them, the plant's cold, dark tunnels were their last hope of survival. Yet even here, safety was fleeting. Russian forces pounded Azovstal with relentless artillery barrages, aerial strikes and ground assaults. The soldiers and civilians alike faced constant danger. The defenders of Azovstal held out for weeks, their endurance capturing the imagination of people around the world. They became symbols of Ukraine's resolve, fighting on even as their situation grew increasingly desperate. While the soldiers fought for every inch of ground, the civilians of Mariupol suffered through an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe. The siege left over 400,000 people without access to clean water, food or medical care. Supplies had run out weeks before, and the situation inside the city was becoming increasingly dire. The brutal conditions inside Mariupol left civilians dying from hunger, dehydration and untreated injuries. Hospitals had been destroyed or rendered non-functional due to shelling, forcing doctors to work in makeshift clinics without proper medical supplies. With no escape routes and no humanitarian corridors successfully negotiated, many civilians were left trapped in the city, forced to endure the relentless bombardment. Satellite images would later reveal entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, as over 90% of the city's buildings were either destroyed or severely damaged. As the battle for Mariupol neared its tragic conclusion, international efforts to evacuate civilians became increasingly urgent. In late April and early May, a series of limited evacuations were conducted from the Azovstal steel plant, allowing a small number of civilians to escape the horrors of the siege. But by May 20th, after nearly 3 months of fighting, the remaining Ukrainian defenders inside the steel plant were forced to surrender. The decision to lay down their arms was made to save the lives of the wounded and civilians still inside the plant. Mariupol had fallen into Russian hands. The siege of Mariupol claimed an immense toll in both human lives and suffering. An estimated 25,000 civilians were killed during the siege, many of them buried under the rubble of their homes or in makeshift graves hastily dug in parks and courtyards. On the military side, Ukrainian casualties included an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers, many of whom fought to the bitter end in the Azovstal steel plant. The Russian military, too, suffered heavy losses, with estimates suggesting between 5,000 and 7,000 Russian soldiers were killed in the battle for Mariupol. Mariupol now stands as a symbol of both the horrors of war and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. As Ukraine continues its struggle for sovereignty and survival, the memory of the siege lives on, a tragic reminder of the costs of war.